Well, I may not get another chance to use this quote because it's one of my favorite quotes, and I've never been in this position before. It's a quote from my favorite poet, Bob Dylan. Now, I'm old enough to remember Bob Dylan, most of you aren't. But the quote is, "Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Yeah. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for he that gets hurt will be he that has stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging." Amen. Woo! And this is the battle. We're talking actually not just about Appalachia here. That's where the harm is being done now, but guess what? The findings that I've got here apply to the entire country. The EPA is behind the times. The EPA has turned a blind eye, and somebody's got to change it. If it's Congress, I'll welcome it. If it's not Congress, I'll go on protesting until the call is heard. The United States is behind the time in science. I'm going to talk to you about something called ultrafine particles. You ever heard of ultrafine particles? Most of you probably haven't. You know why? Nobody does much work on it in this country. You go to Europe, you'll hear nothing but ultrafine particles being talked about by the scientific agencies and by the scientists that are looking at particulate matter. We believe that ultrafine particles, in fact, are the predominant means of most of the health effects that we see in air pollution. They are terrible things. Ultrafine particles have another name. They're called nanoparticles. You heard of nanotechnology? Well, nanotechnology is made up of nanoparticles. And a friend of mine who's a toxicologist and I have an ongoing bet. The ongoing bet is this: the first one who can find a non-toxic nanoparticle wins $5. So far, my $5 are safe. And that's what we're finding here in southern West Virginia. We did an air pollution study and looked at ultrafine particles. We also looked at something called particle deposition in the lungs. Not all particles are created equal. Some particles have a much higher chance of staying in your lungs if you breathe them in, and it's on the basis of the size of the particles that they do that. The EPA has rules out there called PM10 and PM2.5. That refers to particulate matter less than 10 micrometers and particulate matter less than 2.5 micrometers. You think that those rules apply to the dose of particles in the lung, right? They're there to protect your health from air pollution, right? Well, wrong. They're not protecting you. They're not the dose that gets in your lungs. They're the wrong size fractions. And the EPA has known this for 30 years and has done nothing about it. I was at a conference about a year and a half ago where the EPA had done monitoring of fires in North Carolina, forest fires, and the exposure to the people there. The levels that they were seeing were nothing like the levels we see in the mountaintop mining activities. But there the EPA was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars with not a single sampler in southern Appalachia. Where's the EPA? Somebody should be asking. Where's their data? Somebody should be asking. The problem is nobody's asking it. Don't stand in the doorways, don't block up the halls. We want to know, where's the EPA? The effects of ultrafine particles, of these nanoparticles, an ultrafine particle is defined as any particle that's less than approximately 100 nanometers in size. 100 nanometers is really tiny. That's a few molecules big. We know that the effects of ultrafine particles, and we know this because the Europeans have done the work, not us, We know that the effects of ultrafine particles are on the cardiovascular system and on the respiratory system. And if you were watching the news, NIOSH just came out with a press release that says, guess what? Ultrafine particles cause cancer. That's your National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, part of your Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They're on board. They're starting to look. Where's the EPA? That gives you an idea about how big 100 nanometers is. Your human hair is 100 micrometers. A nanometer is 1/1000th of a micrometer. So these are really tiny. They're so tiny they can pass right into your cells as if there were no cellular membrane surrounding them. The cellular membrane is there to protect the inside workings of your cells. The ultrafine particles can pass through without pause. And the reason why we don't see them or don't hear about them very much is that they don't weigh very much. They weigh 1/1,000,000th and less, 1/1,000,000,000th in some cases, of what the PM10 and PM2.5 particles weigh. So on the basis of mass, all of the mass is in the big stuff, in the pumpkin in this case. But all of the numbers are down in the small sizes, the raisins. And so we need a new metric of exposure, and the Europeans have been using particle number rather than particle mass. And they've come up with some standards. Somewhere around 5 to 10,000 particles per cubic centimeter of air is sufficient to take a child who has asthma and cause him to go to the emergency room. All right? Remember that number, 5 to 10,000. That seems like a lot of particles in a cubic centimeter of air. Cubic centimeter is only about the size of a sugar cube, right? So you think, well, 5 to 10,000, that's a lot of particles. That's a couple of orders of magnitude smaller than the concentrations we're finding in the mountaintop mining areas. And the concentrations that we're finding in the mountaintop mining areas are also a good order of magnitude higher than in our control areas, where the rates of disease are much smaller. And so we have also allowed for what size particle deposits in the lung, and even taken down the numbers from that. And even when we allow just those particles that are going to deposit, the Europeans didn't do that, by the way. That 8 to 10,000 was the total number. The amount that deposits is probably 15–20% of that. Well, even with 15 to 20% depositing, we're still a couple of orders of magnitude higher than what the Europeans have said will cause problems. And we know there are pockets of asthma in West Virginia in children. Rates of asthma as high as 25%. 25% is 3 times the national average. Something's causing it. Gee, could it be the ultrafine particles, since they're about 100 times higher than what it takes? Possibly. And that's what we're starting to present at scientific conferences. So this is not going to be a secret for very long. And people are going to be looking around and saying, what's the federal government doing about it? If this act passes, you can tell them. If it doesn't pass, don't stand in the doorways and don't block up the halls, because your replacements are coming. Now, this is, that purple line is the PM10. That's the size selectivity of the sampling that the PM10 is for. And that's what the EPA goes by. The yellow line is the size selectivity of your lungs. The two are supposed to match. Which one of these things is not like the other? You guys grew up during Sesame Street, right? You remember that? Which one of these things is not like the other? The yellow line is not like the purple line. Even Big Bird could tell you that. And so we got down in these areas of mountaintop mining during the summertime and then followed up for an entire year. We wanted to see if what was happening down there just happened during one particular time of the year. It doesn't. It happens year-round. The levels are high year-round. They fluctuate some, but they're always high. And this is some of the data Mike Hendricks was telling you about. That's the age-adjusted mortality for the mountaintop mining areas. Which one of those things is not like the others? And again, we also see lung cancer deaths are higher. Non-cancer lung disease deaths are higher. And we sampled with some interesting equipment, some very simple and some very complex. That's $250,000 worth of scientific instruments in the back of my car. I don't advise people to try doing it on these country roads back there, but we got out with the equipment in one piece. And looking at these areas, this is what the particle size of particles were. This is 1 micrometer. This is the size of a human hair. These are all really tiny particles. This is 100 nanometers. So 100 nanometers are really tiny particles, and that is the predominant size that we're seeing down there. And when we looked at the concentrations, you remember 5 to 10,000 particles? Here's the concentration. 423,000 particles. 423,000. That's a lot more than 5 or 10,000. And it's a lot more than the 260,000 we were seeing in the low disease rate areas. In fact, I'm kind of concerned about the low disease rate areas because we were seeing plenty of disease there too. It just happens to be at a statistically significant lower rate and a statistically significant lower concentration. And even when we allowed for deposition and took the fraction of these that deposited, we're still at 140,000. The bottom line is there's a problem. It's a scientific problem, and we know it. And it's coming from what we see to be the kinds of chemicals that would come from the mountaintop mining. This is crustal material. The U.S. Geological Survey presented that. And so we're pretty sure that what we're seeing is being caused by some activity that's associated with mountaintop mining. And not only do we see that same thing, those concentrations in the areas where they're the sickest people, but we can also take that same material and make animals sick with it too. And we're seeing cardiovascular disease in animals that are treated with this material. So the times are changing. Which side are you on?
Amen.
Thank you, Dr. McCawley. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks. Thank you, everyone who has spoken your truth here today. It's about 3:25 right now, and I just wanted to let anyone who needs to go or wishes to go feel free, because we understand we can't keep you past 3:30. On the other hand, however, if you would like to stick around for a little Q&A, you're welcome to do that as well. And I'd also like to invite Stephen Lester to come up here right now from the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice to talk about some a recent announcement coming on behalf of that organization with regards to the ACAC and the science in the ACAC.
I'll be very brief because I know we're running late today. My name is Steve Lester of Whitby Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. Our organization provides organizing and technical assistance to grassroots community groups nationwide. This morning we released a report on the human health impacts of mountaintop removal mining. Copies of the report are outside the door. It's also available on the web, and I'll give that web address. It's www.chaj.org/MTOP report, MTOP report. What we did in this report is essentially look at the health effects of mountaintop removal mining, and in fact we looked at much of the work that Dr. Hendricks has spoken to this morning. And what we found is that the work that was done and has been done here is a very strong scientific, and that it clearly shows that the relationships between these mountaintop removal activities and adverse health effects. I'm not going to go into the health effects, you've heard about that already. But what we did with our report after we prepared it is we commissioned a group of medical and scientific experts to review our work and to come up with a set of recommendations that they felt are justified. The commission came up with a number of recommendations, and I'll just speak to one of them this morning because I know we're running late. And this is the first recommendation, the main recommendation of this advisory committee. It says, preventive action in the face of uncertainty is warranted. The findings in this report make clear that there is sufficient documentation of the hazards of mountaintop removal mining to place an immediate moratorium on mountaintop removal mining until such time as health studies have been conducted that provide a clearer understanding of the associations between adverse health effects and mountaintop removal mining. In addition, during this moratorium period, appropriate safeguards, including remediation and engineering controls, should be implemented to mitigate existing air and water pollution problems related to mountaintop removal activities. The commission members are in our report. I'm not going to mention who they are at this point because I know we're short on time. But the commission believes these recommendations are necessary to ensure the health and safety of the residents of Appalachia who are impacted by mountaintop removal mining. But it's also clear that these studies cannot continue while the activities continue. There needs to be a moratorium to stop the activities while the research is done. And the Ag Act is an opportunity and a venue for doing that, and the commission is certainly, the recommendation of the commission certainly is consistent with this Ag Act, and we hope the Ag Act passes because it will address this primary recommendation. So with that, I will stop and we'll open the floor to some questions.
I presume that we also have a group via telephone, but given that this